The wind carried snow across the valley like whispered secrets, and Jakob stood at the edge of his property watching the flakes settle on ground that had seen too much of his blood and sweat to ever truly belong to anyone else. His hands, scarred and calloused from 20 years of working timber, hung at his sides like tools he'd forgotten how to use. The house behind him, if you could call it, that was little more than a shack with delusions of adequacy. Plywood patches covered holes in the siding, and the roof sagged in the middle like a broken promise. He'd built it himself when he was 23, young and stupid, and convinced that a man could carve out a life in these mountains with nothing but determination and a willingness to bleed. The bleeding part had turned out to be accurate. The life part was still up for debate. Jakob was 47 now, and the mountain had taken more than it had given. His left knee was held together with surgical pins from a logging accident 5 years back. His hearing in his right ear was mostly gone from years of chainsaw work without proper protection. His marriage had ended a decade ago when Sarah finally admitted what they'd both known, that she'd married a dream of a man rather than the reality of one, and the reality had turned out to be someone who talked more to trees than to his wife. The settlement had taken half of nothing and left him with even less. She'd moved to Portland and remarried within 2 years. He'd stayed here in this shack on this mountain because leaving would have meant admitting that all of it, the sacrifice, the pain, the stubborn insistence that he could make it work, had been for nothing. He heard the car before he saw it, the engine straining on the steep grade of the logging road that served as his driveway. Visitors were rare enough that Jakob felt a flutter of something like anxiety in his chest. The vehicle that emerged from between the trees was a small sedan, completely wrong for this terrain, its undercarriage scraping on rocks that Jakob had stopped bothering to clear years ago. The woman who got out was young, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that took in his property with an expression he couldn't quite read. She wore jeans and a heavy coat that looked new, the kind of thing you bought before moving to the mountains rather than the kind you bought after you'd lived here long enough to know what you actually needed. "Mr. Strand," she called out, her breath misting in the cold air. "Jakob," he said, walking toward her with his characteristic limp. "Mr. Strand was my father, and he's been dead 15 years. She smiled, and it was genuine enough that Jakob felt something in his chest twist uncomfortably. He wasn't used to people smiling at him anymore. "I'm Elise Chen. I called about the timber survey." Jakob remembered now. The county was doing some kind of assessment, updating records, measuring what was left of the old growth forest that had once covered these mountains before men like him had spent their lives cutting it down. He'd agreed to let her onto his property because refusing would have meant phone calls and eventually someone showing up anyway. And at least this way he could control when it happened. "Right," he said. "Survey. I know it's early," Elise said, checking her phone, "but I have 3 other properties to visit today, and yours is the furthest out. I hope that's okay." Jakob shrugged. It wasn't like he had anywhere else to be. His work these days was sporadic, a few days here and there helping other outfits when they needed an extra hand, odd jobs for people in the valley, just enough to keep the power on and food in the pantry. The big logging operations didn't want a 47-year-old with a bad knee and partial deafness, no matter how much experience he had. Elise grabbed a backpack and a tablet from her car, and Jakob led her toward the tree line. His property was 40 acres of mixed forest, mostly second growth now, but with a few stands of old timber that had somehow escaped the saws. They walked in silence for a while, Jakob picking the path automatically, his feet knowing every root and rock, even as his mind wandered. "How long have you lived here?" Elise asked, her voice slightly breathless from the climb. 24 years, Jakob said. Built the house myself. Well, the first version of it. It must be beautiful in the summer. Jakob considered this. He supposed it was, though he'd stopped really seeing it years ago. Beauty was a luxury you appreciated when you weren't worried about whether your water pump would make it through another winter, or whether the roof would hold up under the next heavy snow. It's something, he finally said. They reached the first stand of old growth, and Elise's demeanor changed immediately. She moved among the trees with reverence, taking measurements, making notes, occasionally pressing her hand against bark that had been growing since before anyone had named these mountains. Jakob watched her work and felt a familiar ache in his chest, the memory of when he'd first come here, when touching a tree had meant something to him beyond calculating its board, feet value. These are magnificent, Elise said softly. Douglas fir, some of them probably 300 years old. 350 on that one, Jakob said, pointing to the largest. I counted the rings on a fallen sister tree about 100 yards north. Same growth pattern. Elise looked at him with surprise. You count rings? Used to, Jakob said, before I figured out that knowing a tree's age just made it harder to cut it down. They worked through the morning, moving from stand to stand. Elise asked questions, and Jakob answered them, surprised to find that he still knew things, that decades of working timber had left him with knowledge that went deeper than just how to drop a tree or run a saw. He knew the soil composition, the water table depth, which areas flooded in spring and which stayed dry even in the heaviest rains. He knew where the deer bedded down and where the bears denned, and which birds nested where. It was early afternoon when they headed back toward the house. Jakob's knee was aching, a deep throb that meant he'd walked too far without his brace, but he wasn't about to admit it. Elise had stopped talking, focused on her tablet, and Jakob was grateful for the silence until they crested the final rise, and his shack came into view. He saw it then through her eyes, really saw it for the first time in years, the way it listed slightly to one side. The blue tarp covering one section of roof, the windows that didn't quite match because he'd replaced them over the years with whatever he could afford or salvage. The front porch that was less a porch and more a collection of boards that happened to be arranged horizontally. Elise stopped walking. Jakob stopped beside her, waiting for whatever was coming. Judgment, probably. Pity, certainly. He'd gotten good at bearing both. You live here? She asked quietly. Told you I built it myself. Jakob said, aiming for lightness and missing. Never said I built it well. Elise was quiet for a long moment, and Jakob prepared himself for the usual responses. People from town, from the valley, they all had opinions about how he lived, about how he'd let himself go, let the property go, let everything go. He'd heard it all before. Instead, Elise turned to him, and there were tears in her eyes. I don't understand, she said, her voice thick. You know so much, about the trees, the land, everything. You see things that other people don't see. You understand this mountain in a way that most people could never understand anything. Jakob felt his jaw tighten, knowing things doesn't pay the bills. That's not what I mean, Elise said. She gestured toward the forest they'd just walked through. Do you know what you're out there, the way you move, the way you know exactly where everything is, the way you can read the landscape like it's a book? You're like a giant, like you contain all of this. She swept her arm to encompass the mountain, the valley, the endless trees. You're bigger than just a person. You're this whole place. Jakob felt something break open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut for so long he'd forgotten it was there. And then we come back here, Elise continued, her voice breaking, and you live in this. She couldn't finish. You're bigger than my house, she said finally. The real you, the one I saw out there in the forest. You're bigger than my house, bigger than any house, and you're living in this." Jakob tried to speak and found he couldn't. His throat had closed up, and his eyes were burning, and his chest felt like something was crushing it from the inside. He turned away from her, back toward the valley, because he couldn't let her see what was happening to his face. "I'm fine," he managed to say, but his voice cracked on the words. "No," Elise said gently, "you're not." And that was when Jakob started to cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears that men his age were supposed to cry when they cried at all, but great, gasping sobs that shook his whole body. He put his scarred hands over his face and wept like he hadn't wept since he was a child, since before he'd learned that men weren't supposed to cry, that mountain men especially weren't supposed to cry, that if you were tough enough and strong enough and stubborn enough, you didn't need to cry because you could just push through anything. But he'd been pushing through for 24 years, and Elise was right, he was bigger than this shack, bigger than this life he'd carved out of the mountain's stone and timber. He was all the things he knew, all the trees he'd touched, all the seasons he'd watched turn, all the morning mists and afternoon rains and winter snows that had become part of his blood and bone. He'd poured himself into this mountain until there was nothing left for himself, and he'd thought that was noble, thought that was what men did. But it had just been another way of disappearing. Elise didn't touch him, didn't offer empty comfort. She just stood there, a witness to his breaking, and somehow that made it bearable, made it possible. When the crying finally subsided, Jakob wiped his face with his sleeve and took a shaking breath. "Sorry," he said automatically. "Don't be sorry," Elise said. "Not for that." They stood in silence for a while, the winter sun slanting through the trees, casting long shadows across ground that Jakob had walked 10,000 times, but was only now really seeing again. "What happened?" Elise asked finally. "How did you end up here like this?" Jakob thought about not answering. He'd spent years perfecting the art of not answering questions about himself, of deflecting and redirecting until people stopped asking. But something had cracked open in him, and the words came out before he could stop them. "I thought it would be enough," he said. "The work, the land, the trees. I thought if I could just master this one thing, if I could understand it completely, then I'd have something that nobody could take away from me. Something that was mine, and was it enough?" Jakob laughed, a bitter sound. "The mountain doesn't care if you love it. It just takes what you give and asks for more. I gave it everything, my marriage, my health, my future. And it's still here, exactly the same as it was before I came, but I'm not. I'm less than I was. I'm this." He gestured at the shack, at himself. "You're not less," Elise said firmly. You've been living small. Someone who knows what you know, who sees what you see you should be teaching, writing, guiding. You should be sharing all of that instead of hiding up here, like you did something wrong." "I don't have anything to share," Jakob said. "You have everything to share," Elise corrected. "That's the problem. You have so much, and you're living like you have nothing." Jakob felt tears threatening again and pushed them back. "I don't know how to be anything other than this." "Then learn," Elise said simply. "You learned everything else. Learn how to be the size you actually are instead of trying to fit into something too small." They went inside the shack, and Jakob made coffee on a propane camp stove because the regular stove had stopped working months ago, and he hadn't bothered to fix it. The interior was as spare as a monk's cell. A cot in one corner, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, shelves made from scrap lumber holding a few books and fewer dishes. But it was clean, Jakob realized with a small sense of pride. He might be broken, but he wasn't dirty. Elise sat at the table and pulled out her tablet. "Can I show you something?" she asked. Jakob sat across from her, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug for warmth. Elise pulled up a website. This is a program run by the Forest Service. They need consultants, people with deep knowledge of specific ecosystems. They need people who can train new foresters, who can lead educational hikes, who can help with sustainable forestry assessments. She looked up at him. They need people like you. I'm not. Jakob started. You are, Elise interrupted, and I'm going to recommend you. I have that authority as part of this survey work. I can flag landowners who demonstrate exceptional knowledge of their ecosystems. I don't have any credentials, Jakob said. I barely finished high school. You have 24 years of lived experience, Elise said. That's worth more than any degree. And the program has provisions for people who came up through practical work rather than formal education. Jakob stared at the screen, at the photos of smiling people leading groups through forests, pointing at trees, teaching. It looked like something from another world, a world where people like him didn't exist. I can't afford to leave here, he said finally. This is all I have. You could rent the house out in summers, Elise said. Hunters, fishermen. People pay decent money for remote cabin experiences, and the consulting work pays actual wages, Jakob, enough to maybe fix this place up, or buy something better, or just live like a human being instead of a hermit. Jakob felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Hope, maybe. Or just the memory of hope, so faint he wasn't sure if it was real or if he was imagining it. Why are you doing this? He asked. Elise was quiet for a moment. My dad was like you, she said finally. Not a logger, but a fisherman. Spent his whole life on boats, knew everything about the ocean, about fish migrations and weather patterns and currents. And he died in a trailer park when he was 58, broke and alone, because he thought that knowledge wasn't worth anything unless he was using it to catch fish. She met Jakob's eyes. I don't want to do another survey in 15 years and find out you ended the same way. Not when you have so much to give. Jakob felt the tears coming again and didn't try to stop them this time. He cried quietly while Elise pretended to be very interested in her tablet, giving him the dignity of not being watched. When he was done, he felt emptied out but also strangely lighter. As if the tears had carried away weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. Okay, he said. Okay. Elise looked up. I'll try, Jakob said. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can be what you think I am, but I'll try. Elise smiled, and it transformed her entire face. That's all anyone can do. She left an hour later, her sedan scraping its way back down the mountain. Jakob stood in front of his shack and looked at it with new eyes. It was still a disaster. He was still broken, still limping, still half, deaf and fully poor. But Elise was right, He was bigger than this. Somewhere inside him was the man who knew 300 species of plants by touch, who could read weather in the color of the sky, who could track a deer through forest so thick other men got lost in it. That man was still there, had always been there, just buried under years of shame and surrender. Jakob went inside and, for the first time in years, started to plan. He made a list on the back of an envelope, things the shack needed, things he could fix himself, things that required money he didn't have yet, but might have soon. He looked up the Forest Service program on his ancient laptop, reading until his eyes hurt, taking notes in his careful, cramped handwriting. When darkness fell, he made dinner real dinner, not just the instant ramen that had become his default. He found a can of stew in the back of the pantry, heated it properly, ate it at the table instead of standing at the counter. Small things, but they felt monumental. That night, lying on his cot, Jakob listened to the mountain settling around him. The wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the creak of the house responding to temperature changes. He'd heard these sounds every night for 24 years, but tonight they sounded different. Not like the sounds of a prison, but like the sounds of home. He was bigger than this shack, bigger than this life. And maybe it removes personal responsibility. It wasn't too late to step into that bigness. No one feels fully accountable. Jakob closed his eyes and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, fell asleep thinking about the future instead of mourning the past. The mountain would still be there in the morning, but maybe he would be there too, really there, all of him, ready to be as large as the landscape he'd always been too afraid to fully inhabit.